Stanford University.
Welcome. I'm Dr. Tia Rich, and it's my honor to direct Stanford's Contemplation by Design program. This evening's session, titled Valuing Nature in Personal Practice and Societal Transformation, is provided to us by Professor Gretchen Daily. Gretchen is Bing Professor of Environmental Science and co-founder and faculty director of the Natural Capital Project at Stanford University. Her work focuses on understanding the dynamics of change in the biosphere, their implications for human well-being, and the deep societal transformations needed to secure people and nature. She engages extensively with governments, multilateral development banks, businesses, communities, and NGOs. Gretchen co-founded the Natural Capital Project, which is available at the website naturalcapitalproject.org, a global partnership that is integrating the values of nature into policy, finance, and practice globally. Its tools and approaches are now used in 185 nations through the free and open source Natural Capital data and software platform. Gretchen has published several hundred scientific and popular articles and a dozen books, including Green Growth That Works, Natural Capital Policy and Finance Mechanisms from Around the World, One Tree, and The Power of Trees. Gretchen is a fellow of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and has received international honors for her work, including the most recent Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement. Gretchen, we wholeheartedly thank you for your dedication to the well-being of people and the planet, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Welcome, everybody. I'm very grateful for the time we have together here, and I imagine most people are on Pacific time, which is already fairly late, and others might be a bit further east. So what I'd love to do is just dive in together, basically with some reflections, some stories, and then I hope some conversation together. You know, we're diving into a really big topic, namely how to value nature, both in our own kind of thinking, our own orientation and behavior, and then also much beyond us as individuals into this transformation that we need, valuing nature in decision-making at many, many levels involving planning, policy, finance, just day-to-day operations, whether it's of farms or in cities or across countries, across the world. So what I'd love to do is take an approach where I'll probably be a bit lurching. I haven't done this kind of reflection before, especially by Zoom. But what I'd like to do is share some really beautiful images with you, with my collaborator on a couple of the books, The Power of Trees and One Tree, that were mentioned. Thank you, Tia. And so I'd like to share these images and just enter the realm of thinking about valuing nature together. And then I'll share some stories about how to move from this realm of thinking and contemplation into the realm of real engagement and action in the world in these incredible times that we're all living. And there are many just beautiful signs of hope and opportunity opening up, even with the way the crisis and some of the intense suffering is unfolding that we've all experienced to some degree this past pandemic time and with climate impacts and things. So let me just dive in initially with these images and some thoughts on them. So we're starting off in a really beautiful place, thinking about the values of nature, how to value nature in our time, and thinking about both our personal practice and about the much greater societal transformation that we all seek. I'd love to just help situate us initially while looking at this amazing landscape. Some mountains in Costa Rica that I know like the back of my hand, looking across at mountains in neighboring Panama. But having us really step back and think about the immensity of the universe, maybe 2 trillion galaxies, and thinking about, our galaxy, the Milky Way, holding maybe 100 billion to 400 billion stars. Thinking then about just one of those stars that we know as our sun, with 8 planets traveling around it and powered by it. And just one of those planets, planet Earth, having a biosphere, a very thin yet very complex layer of life at its surface. This layer of life, the biosphere, is only about 12 miles thick. This layer, is the only place in the entire universe where we know that life exists. So we human beings, we evolved in the biosphere, our economies, our societies, our cultures. This is our one home. All our blessings, all our struggles, they play out here. And our future will play out here. The incredible thing to think about is just how dependent we are on nature. All people, whether it's people who were living in ancient times or modern people today in the most modern of megacities, whether we live in absolute luxury or whether we live in abject destitution, and whether we live out in these vast, more rural or wild landscapes, or concentrated ever more as most of humanity becomes an urban species, we depend, all of us, intimately and utterly on nature for our well-being. And what I'd like to do is just reflect a little bit in our own minds on some of the basic principles that we can derive both from ecology, just understanding the web of life and evolution, the dynamics of life, the interdependence of all beings, and some of the great traditions of philosophy and spiritual reflection. So interdependency, whether it's through the microbiome inhabiting our bodies, the way we're all basically very complex ecosystems with 10 times more non-human cells in our bodies as we have human cells. This huge array of microorganisms that might scare us if we're not used to thinking about them in there, but that basically make our lives possible, that provide us, as people are just now really discovering, with tremendously important dimensions of both our physical health and our mental health and sort of social well-being. Or whether it's the nature that we find outside ourselves in local parks, on farms, or in farther away places that maybe we visit on holiday, whether it's exotic rainforests or underwater realms, all of us are deeply embedded in this system and in the many processes that kind of drive Earth's life support systems. And one way we can think about this extremely subtle web of relationships, the interbeing that we are a part of, is in terms of all of the both material basics that we get from the web of life, whether it's nutrition, our health, our security, and let's say water, energy, climate, all the way through to the more ethereal senses of well-being, senses of attachment, of belonging, of beauty and spirit, the things that really fulfill and drive us, the things we really hope to help impart to our children and other loved ones. All of this interbeing really hinges on sustaining the web of life. But it opens up a really big question, and that is, given that we're driving today absolutely unprecedented changes in the history of humanity to the biosphere, what should we sustain? Where and how much should we protect? And how can we develop harmonized approaches that protect not only the web of life and the benefits that we depend on, but also that secure the well-being of people, livelihoods, and don't have us pitting sort of the economy against the environment. That's the biggest challenge I'd say that humanity has ever faced. And we haven't solved that challenge yet, but there are a lot of really hopeful signs. And one way to begin thinking about it is just to take a more intimate look at the ways in which we connect with nature. And we can start, again, kind of expanding our view a little bit beyond Earth to imagine living on another planet somewhere else. I mean, that would be absolutely impossible for more than maybe a few minutes. So let's just, if we had some space capsule that we were on, I guess we could do it for longer than a few minutes. But basically, we have no idea how to replicate the life support systems that we take for granted here. Let's just imagine that Tia would assign a terrible homework assignment at the end of our chat this evening. And the homework would involve listing out all of the ecosystems and the species that we would want to bring with us on a one-way trip to the moon. So let's say that Tia would set out in the Oval, a spaceship that you could climb into a week from now and blast off to the moon. And what you'd need to do over the course of this week is just list out the things that you'd want to bring with you to make life not only physically possible, but ideally also, fulfilling up on the moon. Where would you begin? How would you think about that problem? And let's say Tia could magically bring all that stuff up there with you. How would it all work out? It's a really key question, actually, that we all are facing today, however unconscious we might be of it, because ever more we're driving the life on Earth to a moonscape type level. And we see this in a lot of different ways. We're in the greatest extinction period ever known since the dawn of humanity. Just little tidbits of kind of tracking what's happening. For example, if you look across the world at all of the vertebrates, just the mammals, let's just focus on the mammals. And basically the weight of mammals on the planet, 96%, actually a little more, and now is made up just of humanity, our collective weight, plus livestock. And less than 4% remains, to account for all the world's whales, all the elephants, down to the smaller things like monkeys and rabbits. And that's just one measure. There are many other measures of the transformation that we've been bringing about, especially during the past 50 to 100 years, basically our lifespans and those, of our parents. So how do we get intimate enough with nature to understand, given how rapidly we're losing nature and parts of ourselves and the potential for ourselves, how can we get intimate enough with nature to choose wisely what to value most and where to and how to invest our energy and our commitment in securing nature and the biosphere for people and for all the greater essence that is life? So one way to think about this is just to begin reflecting more deeply on the many different types of benefits that we get from nature. And I'd like to do that starting off with thinking about different kinds of knowledge systems In many places in the world, people, through very contrasting traditions, have developed intimate ways of living within nature. And a lot of what has been learned in more indigenous and traditional societies actually is coming to the fore again today, where people are trying to find ways of integrating this knowledge from the past into the modern societies that we have now, and bringing explicit ways of reverence and of the respect and the humility to embrace both the change that we're in and the challenge of managing our own ways of interacting with nature to be sustainable. And just to dive into this more explicitly, maybe I'll give one reflection from Confucius and then really dive into examples that show how to bring these traditions and reflections into modern day practice and action for transformation. So from Confucius, one of his most famous sayings is that there are 3 pathways to wisdom. The first is through contemplation, and that is the noblest. The second is through imitation, and that is the easiest. The third is through experience, and that is the bitterest. What we're in the realm of today is, first of all, this incredible luxury of being able to contemplate and consider a path that will open up a bright future. The second is to look around the world at the best models today and from the past that we can try to replicate and scale to help harmonize people and nature. And the third really is to accelerate our actions, to activate within ourselves and among our communities and among many more people in the world, activate an awareness of the danger that we're in and a drive to do something about it. So I'll give you an example briefly from Costa Rica that has motivated a lot of what's happening in the world, and then we're going to delve into examples from elsewhere. In Costa Rica, they had, at the time when I was a graduate student, the highest deforestation rate ever recorded on the planet. And they were basically a poster child of planetary destruction. That was into the 1990s. And actually a student a little bit older than I am, Alvaro Manya, who had studied at Stanford in economics and then in hydrology, went back to Costa Rica and recognized a way of valuing nature in decision making and made that kind of real and possible for everyone. So through his knowledge and contemplation, basically through all his studies, recognizing the absolutely crucial role that rainforest plays in maintaining livelihoods in Costa Rica, in, for example, providing water security and reducing flood risk, providing reliable irrigation and drinking water supply, and even flow through hydroelectric facilities, which produce about 90% of the country's electricity and are a big export to other countries. The rainforest in Costa Rica that had been so heavily depleted also provides a lot of pharmaceuticals. The basis of most pharmaceuticals today is plants, actually. It's not eye of newt and other things that we read about in witches' brews, but it's basically plants that have spent all of their evolutionary history, rooted in place and having to defend themselves from attack, basically through diabolical chemistry. And, just the tiniest bits of these active compounds in plants are incredibly powerful in pharmaceuticals for people. We know how powerful they are in just spicing or seasoning food, and in many other types of uses. So recognizing that, recognizing as well the dependence of the country on ecotourism, and finally the dependence of Costa Rica and the whole world on a stable climate system where rainforest and other ecosystems play a tremendous role in storing carbon in a safe place out of the atmosphere. Alvaro went out with colleagues and brokered deals across the world that basically involved different entities paying in for reforestation and restoration across the country. And this program, this payment for ecosystem services program, has been so successful, it's now been modeled across the world and will be a core part of what I propose as a way that we're seeing take off across the world, through which we might be able to realize the hopeful future that we have of an ecological civilization. So let me just dive in now to moving this kind of knowledge into action. Now I'm moving from Costa Rica into China, another place that I'll describe in more detail in a moment, but where we've seen some of the greatest advances worldwide, along with Costa Rica. China tasted the bitterest experience, where in this case, there have been many types of experience, but going back to the late 90s, when Costa Rica was really activated to change, China also experienced in 1997 a record drought with absolutely devastating effects, drying up of parts of the Yellow River, for example. And then in 1998, absolutely biblical flooding that had also devastating impacts on tens of millions of people with enormous costs, billions, maybe 35. It's hard to put into monetary terms the tragedy that this flood was, but maybe $35 billion in damages, a lower bound estimate put forth by Swiss Re. And the Chinese Academy of Sciences, Swiss Re, and others looking at the causes of flooding determined that, kind of as in the case of Costa Rica, it was deforestation, kind of a lack of appreciation and valuing of forest standing up in the upper reaches of the major river systems, especially the Yangtze River, that had really accentuated the risk of flooding. And basically overnight, China committed to restoration and to basically never letting that happen again. And with that commitment came, based partly building on what Costa Rica had done, the largest payment system anywhere in the world, with over 120 million households enrolled and being paid to help restore forest to all of the steep slopes in China that are prone to this flood risk and devastation downstream. So with those two examples, we've seen a lot of efforts toward transformation, and we're basically entering a lot of unknown territory. There are a lot of kind of seeds of ideas and pathways opening up of really promising action. And I'd like to describe those to you some now. And maybe I'll just keep this slide up if that works well for others in thinking about the unknown. So if anyone prefers me to put away the pictures for now, I will. But I think with this picture in place, we could dive into the idea of transformation, of first of all, accepting that we're experiencing now, and we will continue to experience some extremes that we might never have imagined when we were younger. Extremes in climate experience, like the fires that are devastating California and other parts of the world, and Siberia and many other places. The heat waves that are enveloping communities and large cities all across the world. And then other kinds of extremes that in our great fortune in the Stanford community and maybe among others who've joined this moment of reflection tonight, we might not have the awareness of how dramatically transformed much of the planet is. In many places, the air is so polluted that kids have never seen stars and don't believe that there are stars. In many places, the soil has been so badly depleted and actually poisoned that health is severely compromised, even through what could be nutritious food. For example, right in the Central Valley in California, over the past decade, just the concentration of calcium in the kinds of veggies we've been taught are the most healthy thing, like kale, has dropped in places by 90% thanks to depletive practices of agriculture. So all over there are dramatic changes underway, some of them really undesirable, and then many actual, really beautiful opportunities opening up. And I'd like to dive into some of those beautiful opportunities to reverse what's happening and drive a real shift, an awakening as to the values of nature, the utter dependence of people on nature, and the tremendous impacts we have even in our day-to-day choices on nature, impacts that we never thought on our big, beautiful blue planet we would be able to have. But this pathway opening up, really involving regenerating and revitalizing nature, that's the outcome, together with securing human well-being in a much more just and equitable way that we're all reaching for. So I'm going to now transition a little bit to a major effort that is embodied in the Natural Capital Project. And this effort is focused on driving this deep cultural shift in how we think, how we make decisions, both at individual levels and more broadly across society around where we live, but also across sectors, economic sectors, and across the world, to very rapidly, much more rapidly than we've managed to do anything else really in human history, start this regenerating and revitalizing. So first off, what is the Natural Capital Project? The initial idea was to build on the really powerful success stories in places like Costa Rica, like China, and elsewhere. I'll give one other example, and that is of New York City. So taking a place in the US, or I could give a local example of Napa. I'll give both really quickly. In New York City, back in the 1990s as well, there was really quite an alarming decline in water quality. And there are about 10 million people living and working in the city, dependent on upstream watershed areas for about 90% of the water. Those areas are the Catskills Mountains, the beautiful kind of New England landscape that everyone fantasizes about visiting if we're not lucky enough to live there. And something was really making water quality go down. And there, people recognized pretty quickly it was the basically development boom that had really accelerated in the 1980s. Many people building homes there, dependent on this upstream watershed, not like completely unlike this one in Zhejiang province in China, where there's a lot of farming. Here we're looking at rice. In the upstate of New York, it's apples, and there's a lot of dairy and also some beautiful forestry. And those activities, plus kind of expansion of residential areas around towns, were really compromising the life support services of the nature in the area in purifying water that then flows down into New York's water supply system. In compromising the water, it was really putting many people's health at risk. And the upshot of this was, first off, an attempt to replace that natural water purification system with a built filtration plant. That was a logical thing to do. Civil engineers have been trained to do that. They had a plant, it's still there in part of the water supply for the city in the Croton watershed, supplying 10% of the city's water. But this other plant, the big one, would have cost $6 to $8 billion. And it was that price tag and the enormous annual operating expenses that really gave people pause and made people consider investing instead in nature. And this was a big leap into the unknown back then in the late 1990s. The cities historically in France and elsewhere had on record chosen to make sometimes watershed restoration investments. But in general, cities have been built in a way without much thought to the management of land upstream to maintain water quality and supply. And so New York leapt into the unknown and agreed to fund the city in making these restoration and sort of revitalizing investments, both in nature as well as in basically the farming, forestry, and other kind of town activities. And those investments have really paid off, and they've amounted to less than $1.5 billion as compared to the $6 to $8 billion price tag that would have been involved in trying to replace that one benefit from nature to people, the water supply service benefit. And so that's an example where even this really lower bound approach to valuing nature, but bringing it explicitly into decision making, where that proved quite transformative. We could think of all the other values looking in this beautiful image here that were protected and basically ask ourselves, would we rather spend a romantic weekend in a built water filtration plant or up in a beautiful mountainous watershed area, such as in the Catskills or here in Zhejiang province in China? And we can recognize all these other benefits that are protected under the umbrella of this one benefit that everybody is in agreement on and wants to drive investments in. So from this New York City case, I can say that now, through the Natural Capital Project, this has been replicated all over the world. And the way that's been done is through this partnership and through basically that Confucian reflection on developing the science to support those investments in upper watershed areas like this, making the science accessible and actionable, because most science is so locked up in journals and in kind of language and areas of sort of highly skilled expertise that most normal people do not have access to the vast majority of human knowledge. So making that accessible through simple, easy to use tools available and applicable anywhere in the world is the second way by which this happened. And then the third key way is through engaging with communities all over. And in the case of the Natural Capital Project, we've worked in about 50 different watersheds across the planet in mostly Latin America, and now supporting many others beyond Latin America in establishing what New York established, this agreement and investment in the upstream community and part of the biosphere to achieve this win-win outcome for upstream and downstream people who are much more interconnected than might be evident at the surface, and also the interconnection between people and nature. And while we reflect a little bit more into the unknown and into another case in the US, I'll just describe briefly closer to Stanford, the case of Napa. Napa is this beautiful region, the wine growing region we all know of, north of Stanford in the north part of the Bay Area. And it faced tremendous flood risk over a 40-year period, also culminating in the late 1990s when a lot of this transformation, at least these seeds of transformation, really were initially sown, born out of bitter experience. So Napa had endured and really suffered a lot of tragedy, over $1 billion in damages, quite a few lives lost from flooding of the Napa River. And the town itself was a place no one really visited. While people would go to the wineries and such, the town was at such grave flood risk that, no one had invested in it. I tried to go to the bakery there and it was boarded up. What really changed was when a young student actually at Berkeley, together with a writer from San Antonio who'd seen investments in the river in San Antonio and thought about kind of imitating the success of San Antonio in a very different sort of place in Napa. When those two teamed up and opened a vision for a better future, they really sparked the imagination of townspeople who agreed to invest rather than paying, it would have been about $150 million going into dikes and levees and other engineered approaches to achieving flood security from events like the storm that hit us out here just last Sunday. They invested instead in restoring this natural wetland that had once been a major area that would have water levels naturally rising and falling, and that could serve as security in times of high waters when the river was really flowing fast and high, and capture that flood water, protecting the town and people living around it. And so that actually came into being. Over 650 acres were restored of this wetland, even though that cost more as compared to the $150 estimated $150 million for engineered solutions. This natural approach cost about $200 million. But townspeople, recognizing the many other benefits, the many win-wins that would come with making the river a living river and making the town like a river town, and accepting and embracing the interdependence of the river and the town, the people made this investment, elevating local taxes, which is almost an unheard of thing, we think, in America, increasing local taxes, getting some support federally to cover much of the bill and so on, and made these investments. And this is seen as a tremendous success still today, with the town revitalized, with many activities that visitors can participate in along the river and even in the wetland, fishing and boating and cycling along trails that run through it and that are accessible during the drier periods of the year. So those are a couple of examples. And what we wanted to do with the Natural Capital Project, going back to this effort to, following the Confucius guidance, imitate, avoid the bitterest experience, and really scale up planet-wide, was three things. And the first was just to advance the science, our understanding of human dependence on nature in many, many different realms, for health, for water security, in health, and removing or greatly mitigating disease risk, giardia, cryptosporidium, other things that could get into water supply. Many other dimensions of health, such as mental health, many other physical dimensions of health, cardiovascular, metabolic, relating to prevention of many different types of cancer and many different types of disease are known now should be intimately connected to experience of nature. We also know that city living, like the heat waves that we're experiencing more in cities, these urban heat island effects, those can be greatly reduced. And city living can become much more comfortable with greater investment in green space and blue space, little parks and other areas within and around cities, and waterways, whether rivers or wetlands or like the beautiful bay that we have around our area here at Stanford. Investing in their health and vitality can greatly improve conditions within cities. We can also think about coastal resilience and develop the science basically to protect human well-being and nature at the same time in a way that almost everywhere is more cost-effective than taking, say, engineered or built approaches alone. So this science over the past 20 or so years since the transformation in Costa Rica, in China, in New York City, in Napa, and in many other places, this science has advanced tremendously, answering the question more and more for us of where and how much to protect. And then the second question comes up of how to harmonize protection or regeneration and revitalization of nature together with human livelihoods so that we have win-win outcomes like we saw basically in New York and Napa, where there's a lot more detail, same in Costa Rica, where I'm not going to get into all the detail, but in all of these places, people in part are being paid to drive that regeneration. So people who make their livelihoods on the land or on the water, who have the deep expertise, deep connection and familiarity with the land and water, are being paid to turn that expertise somewhat away from producing, let's say, only rice, but instead producing a wide array of co-benefits, of other benefits to go along with agricultural production. This kind of investment is happening all over the world, guided by the second thing is this software showing where investments would yield the greatest benefits. So many places are mapping out landscapes like this shown here across maybe small counties, but up to state or provincial levels, and even across whole countries, mapping out the critical areas of nature that are most important for providing benefits to people, and the critical land stewards or stewards on the water and coastlines along rivers and elsewhere can be part of the system, bringing much more honor and respect to rural livelihoods that in many places have really been kind of left behind. The investments now, I'll just give an example from first Latin America and the Caribbean, and then China, are really pretty mind-blowing. So using this science embedded in accessible software tools across Latin America and the Caribbean, there's been targeting of the key coastal areas, the mangroves, the seagrass beds, the beautiful coral reefs that are crucial to protecting people and property from the ever-intensifying storms and other climate impacts, sea level rise, and so on. And now across the 26 countries of Latin America and the Caribbean that are part of the Inter-American Development Bank, this approach is really being scaled up and embedded formally in development planning, these 20-year future-looking development plans that countries make and negotiate together with these multilateral development banks meant to be looking after the public good and driving improvements in human well-being. They're ever more intimately connected now to ecosystems, to parts of the biosphere that are crucial to maintaining them, maintaining well-being. So we've seen this approach adopted and standardized now across Latin America and the Caribbean. I'll give another example and develop a few more stories around it. In the case of China, it really has embraced this kind of approach in a way that goes beyond what other countries have done so far. China has zoned fully 50% of its land area, having maybe tasted the worst of disaster in the extreme drought and flooding that I mentioned, but also in poisoning of the air, of the water, and in many other environmental impacts that we might know personally and certainly have read about. So China has zoned 50% of its land area for regeneration of ecosystems. And it's paying so far about 200 million people to conduct that work. It's just a massive transformation that involves every part of the government and every kind of sector of the economy moving toward an ecological civilization. And these, I'm sure, are just the very first steps. But amazingly, over the first 10 years, from 2000, right after the extreme flooding, when they started stopping the really heavy deforestation and trying to reverse that, they now have the highest reforestation rate in the world. Over that 10-year period from 2000 to 2010, China has achieved a great improvement in most ecosystem benefits to people, in food security within the country, in carbon sequestration, benefiting the whole world and storing more carbon out of the atmosphere, in water security, water quantity, water quality, timing of flow, so reducing flood risk, maintaining the economic efficiency and productivity of hydropower, and reliable sort of irrigation and drinking water supplies, reducing sandstorms, another massive problem in the northeast of China especially, and securing many other aspects of what's now called ecological security in the country. And this approach, this sort of demonstration, has involved a lot of policy changes and a lot of rural people in, I'll show kind of the next slide, in many small communities, really transforming the way they see and use the land. So there's been a lot of worry in converting some cropland in these steep mountainous areas to forest, which is much better for downstream people and also for the global community in providing more climate security. But there's been worry, are people being hurt by these policies at the local level in these small communities, or are we really able to design them in a way that yields kind of a win-win? And this is where, just to give more of a personal story, just like Alvaro Manya in Costa Rica knew the country like the back of his hand and knew how to design payments in a way that would actually work for people in little communities farming less than an acre of land and really at the margin in some ways of survival. In China as well, there's been great effort to ensure that the payments going to these communities are actually improving people's lives as well as securing nature and downstream or downwind or global benefits. And so one of my students who came from China and did her doctoral work on how to achieve kind of a gold standard, a win-win outcome for nature and people. She actually hiked up to 2 or more days to interview people in very remote communities, in areas that are receiving these payments, to see how they make their lives, how they use forest and wood products in general to cook breakfast, to heat their homes during the cold winters, and so on. She helped design and revise government policies and these payment schemes to enable that win-win. And it really requires that kind of intimacy and that deep knowledge of the humanity living across these places that those of us living down in urban centers don't know very much about. Requires that intimacy of understanding to get things right. It requires that crossing of scales from what we think of as remote, although it's obviously not remote to the villagers living there. It's the heart of their place in the biosphere. But for all of us, half of humanity, more than half now living in cities and remote from nature, we really need to be connected and engaged in the policies that we bring in. And so overall, like the 3/4 of people receiving these payments in China reported in surveying now many thousands of people, not only by this one student, but many others, a real benefit and improvement in their lives. And the question is how to, create the win-win for everybody, and how to drive this kind of vision globally. And so I'll just conclude with reflections on kind of a third question relating to the first two, which are where and how much to protect, given that we can't protect absolutely everything, and we're experiencing great losses day by day. Second, how to harmonize livelihoods together with protection and regeneration of nature. And third, how do we track progress and how do we guide investments from really major financial kind of institutions and the financial system globally? How do we drive this into nature? And the last idea I want to convey here is one that was born in China and that was then developed by an international community of highly interdisciplinary scientists in economics, in hydrology and ecology and sociology and other areas. GEP, Gross Ecosystem Product, an idea that's now being picked up globally. So the idea here is to develop a way of tracking the health of ecosystems and ecological security underpinning this vision of an ecological civilization. And so we all have some familiarity with gross domestic product. We can see it reported any day we want to check. And we hear about how it guides investments and policies country by country. And we know that basically it's the sum of all the goods and services in an economy, multiplied by their price. And we can use that metric developed kind of almost 100 years ago and then really widely deployed after the Second World War in the 50s and 60s. We can use that approach to look at the health of economies. However imperfect, it has really guided a lot of thinking and policy. And now with the idea here with GEP, it's to develop something similar that quantifies all of the goods and services produced through nature, and to have a metric and a whole framework and system behind it that helps guide investments in places that might have a low GDP, but a very high GEP and a very high value to societies today and in this future. And this idea of GEP has really taken off. It's now being measured and used across China to report the contributions of nature to people, to guide financial investments, and third, kind of to track progress. And recently, just this past March, the UN Statistical Commission has blessed GEP as a framework and an attractive approach for global use. And many countries, since this happened, have now raised their hand and are asking to become part of it and to help transform to a green and inclusive financial system. And a number of the major development banks are now behind this, and what the Natural Capital Project is aiming to do, having supported all this throughout with science, with this software to enable anyone to deploy GEP, and with these further demonstrations of how it can be adapted and implemented in different, quite contrasting countries. We're starting in Colombia, Sri Lanka, and Mongolia, but many other countries are signing up. We want to start in some places where we have deep relationships and some modest and initially very achievable goals, but it's really sparking the imagination and leading many people to be thinking about, here back in Costa Rica, more diversified approaches to farming. With just in closing with a few people, this gentleman Memo, an old friend who's let us work on his farms for 30 years, producing coffee and cacao and about 50 other different products on his farm of just a couple of acres. Going to Danilo, another friend who made his life in construction and basically built all of the major infrastructure in the southern region of Costa Rica, now turning his life actually to rescuing orchids, these incredible array of plants that live in still many small forest fragments that have been blowing down or drying out too much with climate change. And he's bringing them into his tiny, way less than an acre yard. He had hundreds and hundreds, and he has these orchids tied up, and then he's moving them into forest, reflecting on other kinds of inspiration that people are getting from the transformation coming through these programs, recognizing governments and others, leaders in society, talking about and making really meaningful investments in nature. And here, an image, a closing image on a tree that has been honored across the country of Costa Rica, and a community honored for protecting it. This ceiba tree that has been protected from being cut down. It's a remnant rainforest tree that would have grown up before people had settled in modern times in this area, protected by individuals sort of decade by decade. And we're seeing basically worldwide much more individual action that I'd love to talk about if we open up in the time for conversation now. People saying, they're not going to wait, and they're devoting parts of their lives to one form or another of protection and regeneration of nature. And I, with that, want to thank you for participating and reflecting with me, and I hope now conveying a bunch of new ideas or questions about this kind of approach and the ways in which we can all engage in it to scale up and drive a really dramatic shift in the course we're on today for a future in which people and nature together can thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Gretchen. We're so grateful to you for your devotion to these important matters. And a question has come: how do you regenerate, and revitalize in your tireless dedication to making science accessible and to creating these collaborative solutions?
I appreciate that question. I'll say a few things. Maybe it's two things. One is through friendship and love, basically, and trust that comes from these engagements. I'll elaborate just a little bit. So prior to the pandemic, traveled to many places around the world trying to connect across cultural divides that I had never imagined I would have the opportunity to reach across. And with a lot of kind of uncertainty or lack of, confidence or real direction in how to do so. But finding over the years such an embrace, basically a warm embrace across these divides from people, whether in very different places, geographies, and also in very different sectors. And like the most recent divide that I'm trying to span is with the banking community. So I've gone from getting to know many people working the land, and I feel very, very comfortable now there with a farmer anywhere on the planet, but more and more into urban planning and into the financial system. But there too, it's the warmest of welcome and real friendship that has grown up in these collaborations. And that feeling of ever more deepening trust and understanding and commitment to bringing the shared understanding into the tools and approaches, and really shifting approach as we develop things in response to the wisdom coming from those working in the land to working in financial centers and elsewhere. That brings me tremendous kind of joy and replenishment. And then the other thing I'll say is, especially during this whole lockdown period, I've been lucky to be able to garden just in a small patch outside my home here. And I absolutely love regenerating there. So all of the trees in our yard basically have died. There were, a small number, but every one of them bit the dust during the past extreme heat events, literally losing their leaves on the day of some of those, 115-degree moments, and then the drought. But planting all native stuff, and I've been working with some people who know a lot about that. Kathy Crane of the Yerba Buena Nursery around here, and this whole plan of going native, and that's been really enjoyable too, and dragging my kids out to help me. So thanks for that question, and I'd love to hear what regenerates the spirit of others engaged here now.
Thank you for turning the question back to the group. The next question is building upon your reference to the Confucius steps of contemplation and imitation and experience. And it's an inquiry as to whether the philosophy of Lao Tzu or Zhuangzi and the harmonious relationship between humanity and nature is something you're familiar with and would like to speak to.
I appreciate that invitation. And I would say I've been maybe actually since some of the bitterest experience. Yeah, really, sorry, getting kind of emotional just thinking back since the time when my father passed away. And that was about 15 years ago now. I've really tried to delve into the realms that you're describing. And I would not call myself an expert, but actually that is a real source of kind of regeneration for me as well. And I'll share, just since I have it right next to me here, a couple of books that I've been diving into. So in related traditions that I highly recommend. One is by Thich Nhat Hanh, And I know he's come up and been part of the week's events, including in Plum Village where he lives, but the other shore. And it's incredible how, one can derive basic principles from these traditions that really are the same principles that are taught in the science of ecology and in other, like the science of hydrology and climate science and other realms of science, and knowing the dynamics of nature and the biosphere. And another book that I happen to have here and to which I contributed in a small way, coming actually from the Vatican a few years ago, just put out, in fact, in order to help motivate more leaders to commit to the climate accord, the 2015 Paris Agreement. The Pope convened a lot of scientists through his academies, both social scientists and more natural scientists. And I highly recommend that one too, just for a quite contrasting perspective, but that dives with a lot of brutal honesty into the challenges we face and the types of personal commitment and action that we need to take as individuals and also as leaders to solve these problems in time. So I would love to see other sort of recommendations, and I hope, let me not ramble on more. I can see many people writing in, so I'd like to invite more and just thank you for that comment and suggestion.
Thank you. Is there any collaboration between the efforts to measure gross national happiness and gross ecosystem product, as it appears to the participant who asked the question that there would be a lot of interdependence between the measurements?
There absolutely is, and I thank you for that question. And in fact, my beloved neighbor, Mark Mancall, who lived next door and sadly passed away during the pandemic, he had been heavily involved in the development of gross national happiness. He worked for decades in Bhutan and adopted a family who lived just on the other side of the door behind me, next door. And so I learned quite a bit about Bhutan, where gross national happiness has been proposed and adopted to some degree, and also about the challenges in developing that metric. So the short answer is that this is a really new thing, a new path. Just like for gross domestic product, there'll be a lot of kind of kinks to work out in making the ideas lead to the outcomes they're designed to achieve, of improvement of both natural and human well-being and the tight interdependency. And so there's a ways to go, but yes, the GNH is definitely part of the thinking and something that we're building on. Thank you.
And continuing in that topic area, are there examples of corporations and states or local municipalities adopting the GEP, which you mentioned at a UN and a national level? And if there are not, how might an individual initiate their employer to think in those in the GEP terms?
Okay, I love that question. So here's where we are. We're at a brilliant moment when we need people such as yourself jumping in. So basically, GEP was just invented. We put the methodology out in 2020, publishing it in a widely read by science, like academics, journal called PNAS, Proceedings of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. No normal person would read that. And we then went all out in making the framework accessible. So we've tuned the software that is globally available, freely available, and brought in global data layers. So at least those resources for understanding the elements of nature operating, the functioning of the biosphere in any place on the planet. We made great advances in that software and in the data coming from all over the world, the European Space Agency, NASA, many other suppliers of data, and many local suppliers, the UN. And so we're kind of ready to deploy this. And it's a question now of making the framework behind GEP and the ideas behind it attractive and kind of culturally accessible, and doing the cultural translation so that it can be adopted in the practices of states and banks and things. And so we're in the process of doing that now. And China is ahead. They've laid out standards and they're just testing them. It's a very creative phase. So it's not a kind of top-down thing. There's a top-down leadership element saying, we're going to do this. And that's where the other countries that initially have signed up, Colombia, Sri Lanka, and Mongolia, and actually also South Africa, are all gearing up. We have people kind of in place or that we're hiring in the January 2022 timeframe. But that's kind of where we are. We're just now getting off to the races. But it's a time when there needs to be a lot more creative exploration of how best to adopt this. And there are some really good demonstrations that we could adapt and imitate and replicate. But there's also a need just to boldly go in and try things out. And so post-pandemic, we aim to have more in-person meetings on this as we have in the past. And in the meanwhile, we will continue with more virtual discussions. And I invite you to look at the Natural Capital Project website. And we do have regular webinars and things on GEP and the whole framework behind it and how we are realizing these really beautiful outcomes through partners all over the world. So I appreciate that question and welcome. Really hope we'll see a time with a lot of creative engagement with this new approach.
Thank you. We will be entering the website for the Natural Capital Project into chat momentarily, so everyone will know how to get there and continue in this exploration and contribution and collaboration with this important new metric. We have some questions on a more granular level. Someone asked when you mentioned about the depletion of the soil and the decrease in calcium levels in kale, is there a resource or website where one can learn what soils are depleted and how to contribute to the regenerative practice in that region, and not to buy food that's being grown in a way that's just depleting the soil? And how does one become informed and take action?
I appreciate that question. And I feel I don't have an immediate website to point to. I know the Nature Conservancy, for example, has a major program on soil health and restoration of soil health. And I think there are many other efforts, actually. And if you Googled around, I bet you would find some of those. And I would be happy to help search for you if you want to send me an individual email. I can look into this. So I don't have it on the tip of my tongue, but in the past decade, roughly, awareness of what we've all taken for granted forever, the basic health of soils. I used to think of soil as ground up rock. And then one time I did a project actually where in the lab we looked at these organisms that you can see under a regular dissecting microscope, so you don't have to get way down super microscopic, but you can't see them with the naked eye. But the sort of thing that, like, if you drop your sandwich on the soil, and you know how there's that 2-second rule or 10-second rule, I think varying by family, it is unbelievable how many little wonderful beasties there are down there. And in a spoonful of soil, a healthy soil, you would have billions of microorganisms of different sort of micro sizes and things. And that's where this intimacy of knowledge comes in that I was touching on briefly at the beginning. We need people more and more looking at the relationships that you're asking about. But certainly in organic and regenerative farming practices, I highly recommend this movie. Somebody else might need to type it in. It was something like The Best Little Farm in America, maybe. Mm-hmm. There's beautiful videographer, filming in that movie, as well as quite a story. The setting is in California. So there are a lot of resources on this. And in terms of individual action, shifting our food purchasing and habits and diet is one of the main things that we can do, and supporting those producers that are shifting their practices. And I appreciate the other things getting into the chat I can see now on this. And getting beyond, say, peak meat. It looks like in parts of Northern Europe, they are getting now beyond peak meat, just like we think of peak oil and getting beyond that. And if we can all do that in our diets and get beyond conventional high chemical input agriculture into more sustainable agriculture, there's so many things we can do as individuals that will add up to making a really big difference.
Thank you. Another question for you, Gretchen, and then, if we may, has one more. California wildfires in the last 4 years have prompted re-examination of fire prevention practices. Even agencies with forest management policies entrenched for a century are talking about incorporating indigenous practices and, quote, learning to live with fire. What is the outcome of this trend? Since people want to live where there is high fire risk, can they learn to live there, or should they just be forbidden to do so? Maybe fire has a positive economic value if we know how to measure it. And then, building upon the fire example, you had already spoken about the wetlands and the need to have wetlands. And so, to broaden this out in terms of how do you approach the indigenous spirit of harmony and collaboration with the natural systems, and invitation to, let's take the Bay Area, not build everything that can be built between 101 and the Bay.
I'm making a few notes so I stay on track. That is an excellent question. And let me address the forest and fire part of it first. Yeah, there's definitely an urgent need to rethink how we manage forest and how we come to grips with the climate realities that are unfolding. Yeah, when it comes to forest fire and indigenous practices, the best kind of future landscape that we could get to is one that would be much, much closer to what existed back in times when Native people were managing the land, when forest occurred in smaller patches where fires were relatively normal thing and were, actually deliberately ignited to help maintain a diversity of different habitats at different stages of burn, and with a real possibility of limiting the catastrophic fire. So it was much more low temperature burns that would have gone on, and a much more open, you can even see in the old photographs, much more open kind of mountainous Sierra Nevada forest system with a lot of meadows and other areas in between the forest, places that today have really grown up very, very thick with dense forest and that are just, explosive now when they burn, especially after these years of intense drought and heat stress. So what's the path to getting to that better managed and healthier forest system, given especially climate change? One key part of the path is to learn much more about indigenous practices that were deployed to maintain the forest in that earlier state, and then to, implement them as safely and quickly as we can. And that involves, number one, protecting areas that really are at severe risk, where many people's lives and a lot of property would be at risk, and just going in there first and trying to thin the forest and reduce ignition risk throughout the state, as PG&E is trying to do now. And that involves partly mapping forest health and winds and fire dynamics and things like that, and identifying the places where ignition risk is highest and intervening to reduce that. And then finally, living with fire and prescribing burning and so on. And that's going to take, there are a bunch of question marks still here. There's a group I'm going to, how to get there, given that there's so much ready to burn material in the Sierra Nevada. I want to point you to, there are probably many other things people might put into the chat, to this forest resilience bond being put out by, I think it's Blue Forest Conservation. I might be mixing up some of my memory of all these different groups, but they are doing a tremendous job. If you Google the Forest Resilience Bond, you'll see one really inspiring approach in California to driving financial investment in restoration of forest health to avoid catastrophic fire and maintain all the benefits of forest for carbon sequestration and climate security, for flood protection, for downstream water supply, and for communities that live in and around the forest, and all of us that like to visit those areas, and many other parts of the economy. So that's one thing I would point to that is taking off and worthy of understanding better and helping to scale. And then for the Bay Area, should I turn to that one briefly? I don't want to keep people, but I can say that there is a lot of good work happening in the Bay Area in a collaboration between Berkeley and Stanford just recently. And you could see on the Natural Capital website some write-ups about this. We've looked at the role of nature-based approaches to controlling flood risk. And the flood risk is high. Sea level is expected to rise, up to 10 feet by 2100. And that's going to create huge impacts. So you mentioned 101. I mean, all of our transportation systems, many of them, the main highways are right at sea level. The natural gas lines are right along those highways. The communication lines, the power lines are even out in the bay. And so a huge amount of our infrastructure and the delivery of all these benefits that it supports, is at risk. And there are ways to armor people, communities from sea level rise with seawalls that might protect little local communities, but actually be completely devastating to the rest of the bay. because as high tide events occur, if you model kind of the hydrodynamics in the bay, as this Berkeley team is especially skilled in doing, Mark Stacy's lab, and we worked together with him and a student to model all this, you can really see that that would be devastating, and that instead we need a coordinated approach by the multiple 9 counties around the bay to identifying areas that could be restored, marshes, golf courses, other areas made into kind of recreational places that are beneficial for mental and physical health and community gatherings and social well-being and so on, and that can be let to flood when the times come, and otherwise used in all these other ways when the waters aren't high. And those are being implemented. There are a number of, in San Mateo and Santa Clara, places where we can see these hybrid green-gray infrastructure investments in restoration of habitats, and then also some kind of levee system kind of behind them that gets triggered in the really, high-risk moments. So thanks for that question. There's a lot more going on actually around the Bay Area, and I'd love to follow up on that.
Well, on that representation of some good news and collaboration happening locally here in the Bay Area, we want to thank you for your spirit of interbeing, your embodiment of interbeing, and your ability to build relationships around the world, to bring the science that you have worked hard to help create, to illuminate, to bring it into all of our minds and hearts so that we can do our part to support you in the work you're doing and that others are doing. Thank you for your time and your wholehearted presence tonight.
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful for this opportunity and moment together, and I look forward to seeing where we might head together.
Thank you.
And I wish everyone a beautiful rest of the evening.
You as well.